All right, we'll go ahead and kick things off, and there's probably going to be a few more people joining as we go. For this session today, it will be recorded, so it will be made available after the session's over. We'll have it on our website. Plus, we'll also be reaching out to all of you that registered through the site to make you aware of the recording. So that'll be the great thing is it'll be recorded, so you've got it. Let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, quick introduction. My name is Chad Peters. I am the Director of Infrastructure Solutions here at Service Express. I've been with Service Express for just shy of 30 years in that hardware maintenance space. And Service Express, if you are not aware of us or haven't heard as much about us, Service Express, we're focused on third-party maintenance within the data center with a focus on server storage and network maintenance and services. We've been doing that really now for about 32 years. And really, that was kind of the genesis for this webinar today is how do we take that 32 years of experience and begin to share that out with, with our audience, right? And just kind of showcase some things that we've learned to help, anyone who's joining this be able to apply those strategies. So today we're going to focus on kind of 3 key strategies to optimize your data center infrastructure. And really the strategies that we're going to spend time on are going to be a couple things, right? Extending your equipment lifecycle. Now, when I say extending your equipment lifecycle, it doesn't mean keep it forever. Like that's not realistic. But what are some things that we can do? What are some things that we can look at? What are some things that we can understand about our equipment to maybe push it another year or two, right? We're not asking to keep it for 20 years. But how do we go from where we are and just maybe do another year or two to that life cycle? Another strategy that we want to look at today is looking at hardware alternatives. What I mean by that is when it's time to refresh the hardware, because it will ultimately be time to refresh it at some point in time in its life cycle. When we go to refresh it, what are some other solutions out there beyond buying new? How do I leverage the secondary market? How do I leverage used and refurbished equipment to still get the performance needs that my business requires and do it for a fraction of the CapEx spend of buying new? So we'll show you a few examples of how we've done that for others. And again, doesn't mean that everything you buy, you have to buy from Service Express. We're just going to showcase a couple of examples that we've leveraged and been able to put together for our customers. And then lastly, where I'll spend probably most of the time on is how do I leverage a hybrid maintenance approach when it comes to maintaining my data center assets? How do I get the best of both worlds? How do I capitalize where I need to with the OEM? And how do I now leverage a third-party provider to enhance my service in my data center? And really, like I said, take advantage of both of those solutions the right way. So those are going to be the areas that we're going to focus on today. As we're going through this, we do have a Q&A available. So if you do have questions, you can certainly type and submit those in there, and we'll get those responded back to. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about that first strategy of extending equipment lifecycle. So when we think about extending the lifecycle, I first want to start with this kind of an overall timeline, right? We think about equipment from general availability to kind of end of support or end of extended support and beyond. Again, not every OEM does it exactly the same way, and not every model falls into the same timeline. I get there's exceptions, but generally speaking, when we think about equipment timeline, you're something along these kind of main areas and key milestones. All right, you start at a general availability date, kind of year 1, with the equipment being announced. Somewhere around year 3, your warranty expires, and then somewhere down the road, call it year 4-ish, maybe a little longer, depending on the model or product, the OEM will come out with an end of sale or end of life announcement. And the other one you see there, the EOS, end of software maintenance, or you can see end of engineering or end of software support. You're going to see that probably more in play around networking assets, Cisco, Juniper, F5. And then, of course, a couple years after that, we get into this last day of support, end of support life, or end of standard support. Now, you may have another milestone in between end of sale and end of support, and that's going to be end of upgrade. And that's where you maybe can't buy additional upgrades. You can't buy more CPU, memory, disk, IO from the OEM. But generally speaking, these are kind of the key milestones that we most likely see in a product's life cycle. The reason I bring this up is I want to showcase kind of how the OEM addresses and communicates this life cycle to their customers. And what they typically will do is they'll give you kind of this what I would call bathtub curve, right? They will come out and say at the beginning of the product's inception, when it launches, you'll have more upgrades and updates with firmware, more critical updates, which is usually true. That typically happens. As the product ages, as you get into that kind of second year, your hardware fails will flatten, and firmware will kind of go from critical to recommended. But then, as the announcement comes out for end of sale, they're, from the OEM's perspective, they're announcing end of sale because the product will begin to fail more. You're going to start to see kind of this reverse ski slope after end of sale that will tell you that you're going to, incur more failures after that end of sale date. Now, the reality around that, and what we've seen, as we support, several 100,000 pieces of equipment, roughly about 600,000 pieces of equipment, do about 65 to 70,000 service calls, annually. We kind of looked at all that data and we saw the longevity of the equipment and equipment fail more like what you see here with this green bar. We kind of saw that as a gradual incline, not that reverse ski slope or hockey stick. We kind of saw that as a gradual uptick, and the uptick was usually attributed to non-critical items like fans, power supplies, disks, things that are traditionally redundant in that device or asset. So we didn't really see that. Gartner also did kind of a parallel study as well, and they came up to a similar conclusion that we did, is that equipment, once it hits end of sale, doesn't have a drastic change in equipment reliability. It may have a slight uptick year over year, but certainly not, it doesn't fall over the day after end of sale. And so that's kind of what led us to start having conversations with customers around how do we now maybe add another year or two to your current life cycle of the equipment if equipment reliability isn't a driver. Now, I'll be the first to tell you there are other reasons that you refresh. We all get that. You're going to refresh for compliance, compatibility, capacity. Those are all performance. Those are all reasons that you might refresh. I guess what I would say with this illustration and this conversation is end of sale by itself is not the right trigger, right? It is a trigger to maybe look at those other pieces. Hey, do I have a performance issue? Do I have a compatibility, a compliance issue? Do I have a capacity issue? Do I have an equipment reliability issue? But by itself isn't the trigger to go out and refresh. The other thing I would say too is typically, we think about kind of the firmware life cycle for product. And this really, the firmware life cycle is going to play more into a further conversation about leveraging third-party support. But when you think about firmware upgrades, they generally follow a track like what you see here. Early on, you will get more updates at a higher frequency, typically more critical at the early stages of the product's inception. As the product ages, generally speaking, you'll see the update frequency lessen, and they'll also lessen typically in severity. And then by the time you've reached end of support, your firmware updates have really kind of moved from critical and recommended to optional or routine. And if we just think about what do those terms mean, right? Critical, do it now, right? Apply the code as soon as you can. Recommended, do it as it's available. And then really optional and routine, do it if you need to, or do it if you want to, I should say. Do it if it's applicable. And so generally we kind of see firmware fall along the same track of frequency starts to go down and criticality also goes down. And again, that's going to be more applicable later on when we talk about how do I leverage third-party maintenance and why. So again, I wanted to just kick it off with equipment lifecycle, just thinking about should we extend the life, and really what does that mean as it pertains to equipment failure? And just to kind of show you an example of data that we collected on our own based on our install base and our ecosystem that we support, I just happened to grab ProLiant DL380 G10. Very popular ProLiant, the 380 series has always been very popular. I grabbed that and just looked at our failure rate year over year of our install base. And you can see this is how the failure rate kind of trends or tracks. We're not seeing that massive uptick in failure. Even when you get out to year 8, you are getting a gradual incline of non-critical, so disk, fan, power, but you're not seeing a massive uptick in critical system board, memory, CPU, right? Things that will bring the machine down unexpectedly. So based on this data, plus the Gartner study, plus the chart that we just looked at, that's kind of our reasoning that we say, can we look at just pushing out equipment life cycle, again, another year or two, not indefinitely, that's not realistic, and we all get that, but can I push it out another year or two and be able to take advantage of some things we're going to talk about here in a minute about refreshing that hardware. So I'll pause there. If there's any questions, again, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A chat, and we'll get those answered. But again, just wanted to kick it off with that first strategy. How do I now stretch my equipment life cycle another year or two? All right. The next strategy that I want to run towards is looking at hardware alternatives. And to me, this goes hand in hand with equipment lifecycle, because when we sit down with the vast majority of our customers and have a conversation with them, our initial conversation typically starts with asking about refresh. What's that refresh cycle look like today for the customer? And generally, when we sit down with them, the first thing that they say is we refresh everything every 3 years. Like that's the assumption that comes out pretty quickly in the conversation. And that very well could be for some assets. Typically, we don't generally see that, carte blanche across the entire ecosystem. So we start to lean in and we start to ask questions about the different platforms and products and OEMs that they're leveraging. And then what we really get to is what I would call the reality, is that the refresh rate is really more around 5 to 6 years is about what people are actually doing when you take into account getting the budget, migrating the applications, doing all the things that have to happen in order to get set up for a refresh. It now pushes to about 5 or 6 is usually what the reality is. And I get it. There are going to be certain things in the DC that get refreshed at that 3-year mark. But generally speaking, what we see is about 5 years to maybe 6 years on the current reality for most refreshes. And then really what we're asking, right, what we're talking about today is what's it look like to go to 7 years, right? Maybe 8 years, right? So go from 5 to 7, 6 to 8, just bolt on another couple of years. And what does that look like for the business? And what I'm going to showcase to you next is just kind of sharing with you where we've helped customers refresh, kind of at that, 7-year mark. And what we did is a little bit different. Instead of saying refresh and buy new, we said refresh and buy perhaps N-1, or in some cases, a refurbished model of the same one you're looking to purchase new. And you're going to see in these next examples just what that CapEx cost savings looked like. So here's just a first example where we had a customer who was running a VMware environment and they wanted to upgrade their Dell PowerEdges to newer models to take advantage of performance. Makes sense. And so we sat down with them, talked about what they were looking to spec out for processor, memory, and disk. And we were able to come up with a refurbished solution set for them, leveraging that same kind of performance bump they're going to get from buying new with the OEM. And you can just see the differences between that. Uh, and again, we kept them in that same performance range. We didn't degrade the performance down. We kept it in that same performance range. We just leveraged refurbished market product versus OEM new. And, you can see across, there's a small amount of power edge. We were able to really bring a very large savings of, a little over 130K of savings. So that's another great reason we think about refreshing is, what other alternatives are out there? Can I go into that secondary market, refurb market, used market, and get the performance I need at a price point that is drastically lower? Another great example that we see today, very common, is we have customers in the enterprise space that have DS 8000. So maybe they're on a DS 8700, 8800, 8084, and they're looking at now the brand new Gen 10, DS 8A00, and to go invest in that to meet their capacity needs, they might drop 7 figures, maybe 8 figures, depending on the specs. And what we found is we could get those same customers into an N-1 DS8 for a fraction of that. And really save them, in some cases, several hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars from buying new. So I always want to encourage, as that second strategy, to kind of look out there at what might be the art of possible in that kind of used and refurbished space. Another example of doing that, and this is a pretty drastic example in a memory upgrade. Customer wanted to upgrade their memory, and looking to buy that memory new from the OEM was going to be millions of dollars. They then came to us, and we were able to do that for a fraction of that memory cost. Saved them, on average about 95% off buying new. And again, this is not a commercial to go buy from Service Express. It's an education to say, could I use secondary market, used market to enhance my data center? So that's really kind of what we're targeting with this particular strategy. So we've got, how do I go another year or two, extend the life? And then when I extend the life and I want to refresh, how do I now leverage maybe an alternative to buying new? The last strategy to talk about is, now that I've got this equipment in my data center and I'm looking at maintaining this equipment, how can I take advantage of a hybrid maintenance approach? How do I get the best of both worlds? How do I keep the things that need OEM support with the OEM? How do I then leverage the third-party provider for other things? And maybe even a bigger question, how do I know? How do I even choose one or the other? And how can I get that education? So the first things I would say is just kind of a punch list. This is, to me, a simple checklist to work from to begin to ask questions in your environment. First thing I would look at is if it's already reached end of support life, end of standard support, last day of support, whatever definition or acronym the OEM uses for support is no longer available. To me, those devices are prime candidates for third-party support. That just makes sense. Because you think about when you're buying OEM support, and I know I'll probably oversimplify this, but you're getting 3 main things. You're getting parts, smarts, and code. Firmware, microcode, however you want to call it. You're getting those 3 key components from that OEM. Well, when that product goes end of support life, that investment in code development disappears. Right? There's not really incentive for the OEM to keep doing code development once it's end of support. So you've lost a third of the service, but I doubt you got a 30% discount in your charge. More than likely, you now do extended support, and you might go up 30% on your maintenance cost. So that's what I encourage customers. Let's look at the art of possible. Can we leverage a TPM for those things that are into support? The next bullet, more so in the networking space, when that product has reached end of software maintenance, end of engineering, So the OEM isn't developing maintenance releases for that switch, that router, that firewall, that security appliance, that load balancer. Uh, that now becomes potential candidate to move to TPM. Again, going back to the big three, I get parts, smarts, and code. Well, if I don't get code anymore, can I leverage another alternative? And then the next one certainly is really a conversation, with the customer and within your own data center. What is your patching strategy today? Do you patch everything? Do you only patch some things? If it's in dev, do you patch it? Are there areas that you can take advantage of third-party maintenance where you're not actively upgrading the product? It's in a static state. And then the next one, which is not broadcast on a ticker in Times Square or talking about skywriting on an airplane, is identify devices with freely available updates. This is not something that's widely communicated, but it is out there for, quite honestly, a fair amount of product that we all use. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. But when you think about that, things like ProLiant, PowerEdge, Catalyst switching, those are all great candidates that have lifetime free updates. Especially in the ProLiant space, as you get above, Gen 10 and newer. And we'll show you kind of an example of what HP put out that, again, maybe not was widely televised, but certainly can be taken advantage of. And then, again, I'm not saying don't ever use the OEM. Even though I work for a third-party maintenance company, the reality is the OEM still has a part to play. So leverage the OEM where you have to have code on those devices. So if you've got firewall and security on the edge of your network protecting you from malicious intent, and code is out there for that, and you get it by having an active agreement, take advantage of that. Or if you're doing subscription services, if you've got DNA bundled in with the Catalyst switch, yeah, you need the OEM involved for that. So there are certainly times that the OEM should be engaged and involved, but there's several times where you can now look at a TPM solution set and blend those two service options together. And this, one of the things that we would do, and I'm not saying that it has to look like this, it certainly doesn't, but as you're engaging with anyone to talk about strategy around hybrid approach, what we tried to develop was a very simple kind of stoplight, green, yellow, red approach to the assets. Any assets that were green met one of the categories that you see there. It was end of support, the code wasn't being developed, or the code was free. So that's, that was a strategy that we looked at. If it was yellow said, code is being actively developed and you do need an agreement to get it. Let's just talk about what your update strategy is. If you're not updating it, we can move those assets to green. If you are actively updating it, it's critical to your business, we'll move those assets to red. And then red says, keep this with the OEM. It's either a product that shouldn't be supported by TPM for a variety of reasons. It's licensing, needs subscription, things like that, things that just don't fit well with TPM. Keep those things with the OEM. And so one of the first conversations that we would have with a customer in an engagement is we would look at the asset list and just start to talk about what's best fit and why. And you'll see, in this particular example, we still have 21% going to the OEM. It wasn't like we zeroed it out. There's still a play there to leverage the OEM, but all of a sudden about 50% of the assets right out of the gate made better sense to go to TPM. And then this is just an excerpt from HP's website. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but in short, back during roughly COVID, kind of as we all entered that lovely phase of COVID, HPE came out with a document that said, hey, look, when your ProLiant is a Gen 10 or newer, we're going to make all of the firmware assets available. So service packs, ILO updates, BIOS, we're going to make all that available. If it's Gen 9 and earlier, only critical updates, updates that are flagged as critical will be available. But here's one example, though, going back to, could I move things to TPM? Well, if the firmware is free and we can help you identify that, well, that's a great candidate to move to TPM, right? Because now I don't need that OEM entitlement to get that critical code. The things I wanted to kind of end on in this webinar today is just showing you some of those timelines. And again, just visually, when can I leverage a hybrid approach? So if we take Cisco, for example, if you think about the hardware last day of support, that typically occurs a couple of years after Cisco has stopped developing maintenance releases for the software. So you've got this 2-year window that you're paying Cisco for support that maybe you wouldn't have to, because again, they're not releasing those maintenance updates. They're not developing them. So that might be, in that 2-year window, might be a great time to look at a TPM solution. Same thing if we look at F5, well before what they call end of technical support, or EOTS, or end of RMA, so they won't RMA apart. Well before that happens, you get EOSS, end of software support. So again, another great example of I've got this gap of potentially a couple of years where I'm not getting new releases, but I'm paying for that service. And lastly, just another milestone chart here is Juniper. Now this one, you have to have a degree in calculus to look at, but no, to look at it simply, it is, end of engineering date is typically 3 years after end of sale and 2 years before end of support. So again, very common thing you see in the network space, especially, is a couple of years before end of support, they stop producing new levels of software for the device. So again, just wanted to kind of talk through that other strategy of hybrid maintenance approach. And usually the key catalyst and driver for do I use third party or do I use the OEM is what happens to code. And what I would tell you is, in a lot of cases, you'll find that it's free. In other cases, you'll find that it's no longer developed after a point in time. And so you have a great opportunity to at least look at other solution sets out there and blending in OEM and TPM support. So as we kind of take this 30-minute webinar to a close, just to really recap what we've talked about. First thing, how do I just stretch another year or two in the hardware? Where can that be applicable? It may not be 100% of the equipment you have, but can it be some of it? And when I've done that, and it is truly time to refresh, how can I now take advantage of hardware alternatives using maybe an N-1 solution, right? Current Gen -1, or a refurb solution, or potentially just upgrading components in my existing hardware to really save me on that overall CapEx expenditure. And I would also say too, not in every case, but in many cases, we found that when customers are buying equipment used, they're actually getting it faster than buying new. There's usually a lot of shipping delays, configuration delays in going new from the OEM. So we've even found customers get expedited hardware by going in that used market, refurb market. And then lastly, leverage that hybrid approach. It won't work everywhere. I'm not saying it does. You saw by our pie chart, it was, in that particular example, 50% of it was good. But how do I now leverage a hybrid approach to now maximize OpEx and enhance service? So these are the 3 strategies that I really wanted to showcase in our 30 minutes together about if you've leveraged these 3 and blend them together, now you can create, an overall better data center environment and service and a better, CapEx, OpEx spend and savings. So thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join for this short webinar. And again, if you want to learn more about this, feel free to contact us. We do have a link here that you can reach out to us. And also, if you're going to be at Gartner in December out in Vegas for IOCS, I'll be out there. Got a speaking session at that event talking about a very similar thing. So love to spend some time with you, and we can dive a lot deeper into your assets, your infrastructure, and see how we can provide the right solution for you. So thank you, everybody. Have a fantastic day, and look forward to hearing from you.